I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Season 3, Morally Bankrupt. So today, we're going to talk about two kids from nowhere. Before the headlines, before the ballads turned them into symbols, there were just two Texan kids who knew too much about hunger and too little about mercy. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born into a world that chewed people up and called it progress. His family drifted through the lean years of Texas, sharecropping, the kind of life where a man's worth was measured in how long he could work before collapsing. They parked a battered shack on the edge of Dallas, poverty stacked on poverty, and tried to pretend it was home. Clyde taught himself music because melody was cheaper than hope. He could make a tin guitar sound like something worth saving, but the music never lasted. The Depression didn't reward talent. It rewarded survival. And Clyde learned that sometimes to eat, you have to take. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was small but certain. She wrote poems about love and prison and places she'd never see. Her verses tucked between dinner orders and cigarette breaks. She already lived a lifetime by 20. She had been married once, abandoned once, and was done being disappointed by men who promised the moon and handed her a broom. Bonnie wasn't built for violence, but she was built for loyalty. And in West Dallas, that could be deadlier than a gun. When they met, it was not fireworks. It was recognition. Two broken compasses suddenly pointing the same way. He saw in her the courage to keep moving. She saw in him the spark that made the world less empty. The connection was quick, quiet, and absolute. Loneliness met loneliness and called it love. What they built was not a fairy tale. It was a survival plan with a heartbeat. Two people who'd been failed by every system decided to make their own. They promised to trust each other more than they trusted God, law, or luck. And for a while, that promise was enough to keep them alive. The first lie is we don't have a choice. The Great Depression didn't just starve stomachs, it starved judgment. It handed out a script and called it truth. The banks are the villains. The law is the enemy, and the poor must grow harder than the world around them. It was a lie so simple, so seductive that it felt like justice. And for Bonnie and Clyde, it became gospel. Every theft, every gunshot, every fight down a dusty Texas road could be forgiven by that one sentence: we don't have a choice. Clyde's first crimes were barely crimes at all, just a boy testing where the lines were. Stolen cars and petty theft, a bit of swagger in the wrong rooms, but Texas didn't play with its criminals, not even the small ones. Prison caught him early and crushed him thoroughly. He went in hungry and cocky, thinking he could charm his way through anything. He came out with a limp in his spirit. Inside, he saw things that broke his faith in people faster than the Depression ever could. Guards beat him. Men used him. Hope left him. The rumor that he maimed himself with a pipe to escape hard labor might be folklore, but it feels true. Because by the time he walked free, something inside of him was certainly broken. Prison taught him a new theology. Mercy was a trick, and kindness was a setup. The world didn't forgive, it just waited to punish slower. So when he came back to Bonnie, he didn't bring repentance. He brought a rule book written in blood and asphalt. We run, we take, we shoot if we have to. Bonnie did not argue. She didn't dream of being an outlaw, but she did dream of being seen. And Clyde, torn, limping, half mad with pride, saw her. That was enough. She didn't sign his pact with a gun. She signed it with a nod, a promise that loyalty meant more than law. They were young enough to mistake desperation for destiny. They told themselves it was not greed, it was survival, not cruelty, just consequence. But every lie they told to the world began as a lie they told themselves. And that's how a love story became a gang. If you lived anywhere between Texas and the Dakotas in 1932 or 1933, you might have passed them on the road and never known it. A dusty Ford V8 streaking by, windows down, laughter bleeding into the wind. They were everywhere, and nowhere. Road dust and cheap room keys, patched tires and hollow stomachs. Always one town ahead of the law. They lived in rented rooms where the wallpaper peeled like regret, where the clerks learned not to ask questions and the maids learned to knock twice. The Barrow gang was less a crew and more a collection of borrowed souls, each one drifting in and out depending on how bad things got. There was Clyde's brother, Buck, trying to be the voice of reason, but just as drawn to the adrenaline. His wife, Blanche, elegant and terrified, keeping a diary instead of a gun. There were young drifters like Raymond Hamilton and U.D. Jones, boys who joined thinking they'd found excitement and ended up learning fear. And finally, Henry Methvin, the last recruit and the one whose loyalty would later come with a price tag. Loyalty was currency, and everyone was broke. They didn't rob the grand marble banks that made for headlines. They hit the forgotten ones, the mom and pop stores, roadside gas pumps, grocery tills that jingled with nickels and dreams. The hauls were pitiful, $20, maybe $50, sometimes a few cans of gas and a loaf of bread. But the headlines did not print the numbers. They printed the noise, and there was plenty of that. Gunfights came fast, unplanned, and they were ugly. Clyde drove like a man with God in his rear view mirror, and every siren was a sermon. Bonnie reloaded without flinching. In those moments, it didn't feel like crime. It felt like survival played at full volume. The line between running and shooting blurred, and once you cross it enough times, it never reappears. Then came Joplin, Missouri, April 1933, a rented garage apartment, a neighbor's suspicion, and a lawman who knocked too soon. The shootout was chaos, smoke, splinters, and screams bouncing off concrete. When it was over, 2 officers were dead, and the Barrow gang was gone, leaving behind the evidence that would make them immortal. Among the wreckage, guns, poetry, half-eaten food, and film rolls. The photos would do what bullets couldn't. Bonnie, barefoot, playful, a cigar clenched between her teeth, looked every bit the outlaw queen. Clyde, hat tilted, grinning like a movie star. He looked untouchable. Those photographs were poison candy for the newspapers. The public devoured them. Reporters called them the sweetheart bandits, the deadly lovers, America's answer to Robin Hood. The myth was easier to believe than the truth that they were 2 hungry kids in over their heads. Bonnie wasn't a cigar-smoking killer queen. She posed as a joke, an inside laugh for the gang, something to pass the time between chases. But once that picture hit the front page, the joke became her legacy. The camera wrote her epitaph before the bullets ever did. Strip away the smoke, the gunfire, the glamour, and what's left is painfully simple. Bonnie and Clyde were a unit, not heroes, not symbols, not the icons the newspapers carved out of their shadows, just 2 people orbiting each other so tightly that the rest of the world blurred. Their codependence had its own gravity. Clyde needed someone who wouldn't flinch at what he'd become. Prison had taught him cruelty the way a preacher teaches sermons, thoroughly and without apology. He'd seen what men do to survive when the rules rot away, and he couldn't unlearn it. Bonnie didn't try to make him unlearn it. She didn't moralize or recoil. She simply accepted him as he was, and that acceptance became his permission. Bonnie needed something just as fierce, someone who looked at her like she mattered in a world that treated poor women as disposable. Her husband had left, her family pitied her, and every man before Clyde had wanted her quiet. But Clyde listened, maybe not to her words, but to her presence. He made her visible again. That feeling after years of invisibility can feel like salvation. They built their own small world inside the wreckage of the big one. A pocket universe made of exhaustion and adrenaline, where violence equaled safety and running felt like freedom. Fear came for them often, but every time it did, they turned towards each other and away from everyone else. The world was cruel, so they stopped asking for its mercy. That's not love, it's a trauma bond. But even trauma has tenderness. Bonnie dressed his wounds in back-seat motels that smelled like gasoline and gun oil. Clyde carried her when she couldn't walk after a car crash left her leg burned to the bone. He lifted her across fields, risking arrest just to keep her out of sight. They wrote little rhymes to each other on scraps of brown paper and hotel stationery. Bonnie's handwriting was neat, looping, almost girlish. Her words weren't. They were full of death and devotion. Her poems read like both confession and prophecy. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. She knew how the story would end. Maybe that's why she kept writing it, to claim it before the world did. She wanted to be remembered. Clyde wanted to be unstoppable. Those desires shook hands in the dark and called it destiny. And from that moment on, every mile they drove, every gun they raised, every flashbulb that captured their smiles, all of it led towards the same horizon, the one soaked in blood. The killings that changed everything were not glamorous. They were sudden, dirty, and full of panic, just like most real violence. No music, no poetry, no clean escapes. Just gunfire, smoke, and the sickening quiet that follows it. It started as it always did, a back road, a car that would not stop, a nervous officer reaching for his badge before realizing he was already too late. Clyde drove fast and lived faster, convinced that if he slowed down even for a second, the world would catch up and cage him. That fear became reflex. Every siren, every uniform, every shape in the rearview mirror meant death if he didn't strike first. When lawmen died on those roads in Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri, the headlines didn't bother to ask forensics to confirm. The Barrow gang had become the name America used when a crime did not fit neatly into any other box. Sometimes the finger pointed true. Sometimes it pointed just because no one else fit the myth. But the truth didn't matter anymore. The legend already had its fingerprints on every trigger. Some killings were theirs without question. April 1933, Joplin, Missouri, 2 officers dead after a shootout that tore through a quiet neighborhood. July 1933, Platte City, Missouri. Another fight, more blood. Buck Barrow mortally wounded. Blanche captured. The gang scattered like birds. January 1934, East Ham Prison Farm in Texas. Clyde's personal crusade. He ambushed a work detail to free old friends, leaving one prison guard dying in the dirt. That last one sealed their fate. It was no longer about robbery. It was revenge against the system that had broken him. And the system, for once, took it personally. The public, once willing to romanticize the idea of 2 young rebels sticking to the banks, began to turn. People forgave thieves. They saw themselves in the desperation. But cop killers? That crossed the line. America was willing to laugh with its outlaws, but not to die with them. By 1934, the myth had curdled. Were no longer the dashing sweethearts of the Depression. They were murderers, dangerous, contagious, the kind of people who made headlines sell and lawmakers sweat. The shift was seismic. Small town sheriffs who once shrugged off chases started calling in favors. Governors approved funding for manhunts. Lawmen began to speak the same language, their lines of jurisdiction blurring as fast as Bonnie and Clyde's tire tracks. And somewhere in Washington, a young bureau, still learning how to be federal, began to flex. Hoover's men, hungry for proof of purpose, learned to sing in chorus with the state police. The chase changed key, from frustration to fury, from paperwork to warpath. What had started as a love story in stolen cars became a national crusade to end it. And by then, Bonnie and Clyde had nowhere left to run. Enter Frank Hamer, a Texas Ranger who looked like a fence post and moved like a storm, broad-shouldered, sun-scorched, quiet. He had the kind of patience that made men nervous and the kind of certainty that made them dangerous. Hamer had killed before, always under the banner of law, though the difference between law and vengeance blurred easily in those years. When Bonnie and Clyde became national news, Hamer didn't see glamour. He saw chaos, not just the chaos of 2 fugitives tearing across state lines, but the chaos of the press turning killers into icons and lawmen into fools. He spent a lifetime walking the line between frontier justice and bureaucracy, and he knew one thing for certain. If you let legend get too loud, law stops working. So he studied them, not like an enemy, but like a phenomenon, where they ate, how they rested, which roads Clyde trusted, which cars he stole, which he kept, and why. He learned that Clyde's escape routes weren't random, they were loops, a series of comfort zones built on memory and superstition. The Barrow gang had an orbit, and Hamer only had to sit still long enough for gravity to bring them back around. He wasn't looking for a cinematic showdown. He wasn't Wild Earp with a moral speech waiting on his tongue. He wanted to end a cycle, a story that kept repeating itself in the papers while the body count climbed. But Hamer also understood the unwritten rule that held Bonnie and Clyde together. They would never separate, not in life, not in flight, not even in death. If you wanted one, you had to get both. Through a mix of informants, intuition, and patience, Hamer's posse began to close the circle. One of their keys was Henry Methin's father, Ivy Methin, a man trapped between loyalty and survival. He watched his son run with the gang, seen the headlines, and realized that cooperation with the law might be the only way to keep Henry breathing. So the deal was whispered, quiet as guilt. The officers learned about a back road near Gippsland, Louisiana, where Ivy's truck could be broken down at just the right bend. Clyde, ever the loyal friend, would stop to help Henry's father because, in his mind, outlaws still had their own kind of code. That was the trap. Hamer and 5 other lawmen, state police from Texas and Louisiana, set up along the road. They were armed heavy, shotguns and bar rifles, hiding in the brush. Hours passed. Heat built, sweat pooled under the hats. Every mosquito and leaf movement felt like an omen. Hamer's plan was simple and brutal. No warnings, no calls to surrender. The gang had outrun every sheriff from Oklahoma to Texas, killing more than one along the way. The order was to finish it before they had the chance to draw. When the Ford V8 finally appeared, it was the color of dust and speed. Clyde behind the wheel, Bonnie beside him, a half-eaten sandwich in between them. The car slowed when they saw the truck. Clyde leaned out, maybe to speak, maybe to check, maybe just to breathe one last moment of calm. That was all it took. The posse opened fire. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, 130 rounds tearing through metal, glass, and flesh. The car rolled to a stop, riddled like a sieve, the smell of gunpowder and blood hanging thick in the Louisiana air. The debate would start before the smoke cleared. Was it justice or an execution? Was it strategy or vengeance? Hamer did not answer. He holstered his weapon and walked towards the wreck. Whether you read that moment as tactical logic or moral compass depends on how much you've bled, because bullets don't care about editorials. After the shots came the cameras. The gunfire hadn't even finished echoing through the Louisiana trees before the lenses turned towards the wreckage. The bodies inside the Ford belonged to the state now. The imaginations around it belonged to everyone else. Deputies tried to hold the crowd back, but curiosity was stronger. The road filled with locals, gawkers, and photographers, men with notepads, women with baskets, children craning their necks for a glimpse of the famous dead couple. The air reeked of gasoline, blood, and triumph. People pressed close, some cried, some laughed. Some just stared at the 2 figures slumped in the front seat like they were wax statues instead of people whose lungs had just stopped moving. A car doesn't care whether it's sacred or obscene, it just holds what it's given. And in that moment, it held both, the ending of 2 human beings who had finally run out of road, and the beginning of something far more enduring, a new American industry, selling tragedy a spectacle. News photographers snapped every angle they could. The next morning, those photos were everywhere. The Ford became a relic, a traveling attraction. People paid admission to stare at it, bullet holes and all, like pilgrims at a shrine. The tabloids called it the death car, and America lined up to see what justice looked like in metal and flesh. At the Undertaker's parlor in Arcadia, the scene turned grotesque. The embalmer's table became another kind of stage. The undertaker was said to have struggled to keep the bodies intact under the crush of the onlooker. Rumors spread that the crowd clawed at Bonnie's dress for souvenirs, cut her hair for keepsakes, wiped their hands on Clyde's blood-stained shirt, proof of having been there. Whether each tale is perfectly true is almost besides the point. The point is that people wanted them to be true because once you turn flesh into tokens, you convince yourself that you own that story, that you're not just watching violence, you're part of it. The same public that once cheered Bonnie and Clyde for defying the system now consumed their deaths like entertainment. Newspapers sold out, souvenir hunters followed the hearse. Children recited poems about them in the streets. We called them monsters, and then we acted like ones. If you strip away the newspaper romance and the lawman legend, what did Bonnie and Clyde really have? Not fame, not freedom, just each other, and even that came at a cost. They had tenderness in the margins, the kind that doesn't make headlines. The way she teased him when he missed a note on the guitar, the way he kept the car running while she limped to the passenger side, waiting until she was settled before shifting gears. They shared stale bread, bruised apples, and lukewarm coffee. They laughed at jokes no one else would ever hear. Their world was small enough to fit in the back seat of a Ford, and in that smallness, they built something that looked from the outside like devotion. They slept in cars with the windows cracked and guns under their seats. They took turns watching the road. At night, every siren in the distance felt like a countdown, and every morning that came without the sound of a siren felt like a miracle. They had loyalty that outlasted food, money, incense, a promise whispered in motel rooms and ditches and safe houses. And that is what makes people call it love. But love that demands the world bleed to prove itself is not love. It is extreme. It's worship disguised as passion. Their devotion hardened into something brittle, a refusal to live any life that did not feel cinematic. They were more afraid of being ordinary than being dead. They mistook adrenaline for purpose, danger for destiny, and each other for redemption. Thanks for listening to Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt, where every outlaw leaves a debt and history always comes to collect. Tap like, share, and follow to help keep that story straight and the past alive. Until next time, I'm Becca, and this was Deadly Truths. And I want to give a huge thank you to all of you who are following and sharing. It means a lot.